David Crockett, Scout, by Charles Fletcher Allen. Chapter 1. The Young Frontiersman. The antecedents of Davy Crockett are Irish, although his mother was Rebecca Hawkins, a native of Maryland, and probably of English descent. After the execution of King Charles I, in the 17th century, many Irishmen were transported to North America as rebels, and there sold into a state of slavery among the English colonists. Many of them were sent to Virginia and to the Somers or Bermuda Islands, and in Sir J. H. Lefroy's Memorials of Bermuda occur the names of James Sheehan and David Larrigan as two of the slaves bought and sold in those islands. As we might expect, the same records often make mention of the unruly and riotous nature of the Irish rebels, and of the complaints of those who thought the colony might well be rid of them. It was the blood of the fighting race that told, and one by one the slaves became free men, to follow every bugle call or rolling drum that has led into the storms of shot and shell on our country's battlefields. David Crockett's grandparents left Ireland for America after the birth of William, their oldest son, and it is supposed that John Crockett, another son, and the father of David, was born during the voyage. The family, which eventually included 4 boys, settled in Pennsylvania. Here John Crockett lived as a farmer for some time, removing while still a young man to Lincoln County, North Carolina, and afterwards to the Tennessee mountain country. His parents, displaying the same restlessness that characterized the career of David, came into what is now Hawkins County, Tennessee, and settled near the site of the present town of Rogersville. It is not unlikely that the county took its name from the family to which Rebecca Hawkins belonged. The Creek Indians had now begun to feel the pressure of immigration into their sacred hunting grounds, and were at all times dangerous, frequent encounters occurring between them and the settlers. Both of Davy's grandparents were killed during an Indian foray near the Holston River in Hawkins County. In this bloody affair their son Joseph had his arm broken by a bullet, though he finally escaped. His brother James, who was near deaf and dumb, remained a prisoner for more than 17 years. It was without doubt due to his being deaf and dumb that he was finally heard of and identified by Davy's father and Uncle William, who paid some sort of ransom and obtained his freedom. He lived for many years in Cumberland County, Kentucky. Davy Crockett was the 5th of 6 sons, and there were 3 sisters besides, or 9 children in all, in the family of John Crockett. In his own story, Davy makes little use of the names of his relatives, and although some of them are known, they are not material to this narrative. Davy Crockett was born on the 17th of August, 1786. At this time, the Gateses, Lees, and rough Yankee generals, as Carlyle styled them, had returned to their own shores, and were striving to form a permanent union of the states. The courts of the Old World were vying with each other in extravagance and riotous living. But the great Smoky Mountains were full of peace, and from the Unaka Range to the far blue crest of the Cumberlands, the troubles of the far-off world were but echoes faintly heard. The new and short-lived state of Franklin was a year old, and John Crockett, veteran of the Revolution, was content to work there from dawn till dark, that his children might be fed and housed. The mountains were full of game, corn could be raised when the ground was cleared, and the autumn yielded bountiful stores of nuts, wild grapes, berries, and apples, until from one source or another the cabin was filled with winter supplies. Yet somehow there always seemed to be insufficient for the long months before the anemones and azaleas came again beside the leaping brooks or under the tender green of the awakening trees. The log cabin of the Crockett family stood where the limestone creek joined the Nolichucky River, 10 miles north of the Great Bend in the Bald Mountain Range. There the rocky summits, angling abruptly about the watersheds of Indian Creek, are like fortifications of the Titans, crowned with battlements of the Appalachian Range, whose peaks stand more than 6,000 feet above the sea, higher than any others east of the Mississippi. From the rocky escarpments between the black forests of pine and hemlock shone the signal fires of the Creek and Chickasaw, and from unseen nooks between their giant flanks the thump, thump, thump of the tom-tom caused the pioneer to look to his stockades and his flintlock guns. The fierce ebb and flow of war that had given Kentucky the name of the Dark and Bloody Ground had now and then swept over parts of Tennessee. The massacre of Fort Loudon was a red spot upon the pages of her history. But the rivalries of the English, French, and Spanish had promoted Indian raids in the disputable regions of the Ohio and the Mississippi, rather than in the lowlands of the western part of the state and in the Alabama plains. What Tennessee was sparred in earlier days she knew in the Civil War in 1861 to 1865, when from Knoxville to Donelson and Shiloh, and from Lookout Mountain to the Cumberland Gap, her fields were filled with unknown graves and the wreck and misery of a terrible conflict. It was not until many years after the birth of Crockett that it became safe to travel the rugged roads between Virginia and North Carolina and the Nashville country. In the 20 or more trips that Andrew Jackson made between Jonesboro and Nashville in the days when he was foremost in the practice of law, he had many a close call and Indian fights. More than a score of times he came upon the bodies of men, women, and children, robed and slain and scalped. Little Davy, listening at nightfall beside the river, hearing above its murmur the hoot of the owl in the dismal trees, the howl of the wolf on the mountain top, or the panther's anguished cry floating out of the vague unknown, would make good use of his sturdy little legs until he was safe at his mother's side. As the boy grew older, he lost the instinctive sense of fear that was perhaps a part of his natural heritage, for the cry of the banshee had filled the souls of his Irish forebears with terror in their lowly cabins across the seas. Something of the daring of Sir John and of Richard his son, of the Hawkins kin, slavers, freebooters, sea scourgers, admirals, had come to him on his mother's side, and now, too, the fighting blood of his father's race began to show. Davy was scarce 6 years old when 4 of his brothers and a boy named Campbell had left him on the shore of the Nolichucky, while they put out into the river in the rude boat that was used in crossing the stream. Had it not been for the bravery of a man named Kendall, who saw their danger, the 5 boys would surely have gone over the falls a little way below, which would have meant certain death. Davy seems partly to have realized their danger, but said he was too fighting mad at being left behind to care what happened to them. When they were safe again, his greatest satisfaction was in telling them that the scrape they had been in was what they had earned for not taking him long. Like every boy of the frontier, Davy was quick to idolize the great flintlock rifles, powder horns, and other implements of the hunter. He loved to watch his father mold bullets from the well-nigh priceless supply of lead, or cut and grease patches for loading. The boy would sometimes shoulder his stick and imagine himself a hunter, stimulated perhaps by the loan of a powder horn and a hunting knife. All this was evidence of what was working in his mind. An old man who knew the boy, and always called him the Corkconian, said that the only diff between a crowbar and a gun is that the gun do have a hole in it and a stock. The hunter's rifle was made from a bar of iron weighing about the same as a crowbar, from 11 to 15 pounds being the usual weight of the gun. From this it is easy to see that the small boy of 1795 could not take a very active part in the hunting that furnished the greater portion of the supply of food for the pioneer and his family. In talking with General Grant, who had suggested a way in which the reserves might be of use while not needed at the front, Abraham Lincoln once said, "Oh yes, I see that. As we say out west, if a man can't skin, he can hold a leg for the one that does." A 5-year-old boy might not be able to hunt and kill deer, but he could hold a leg. The boy of today can go forth with a 4-pound .22 with less fatigue than his grandfather felt in handling a rifle when 10 years older. At the age of 15, a boy might learn to shoot, but he was hardly able to range the mountains for game. It was on a day in August, when Davy was 6 years old, that his father and his uncle took him with them on a hunting trip into the dark forests of pine on the northern slopes of the Bald Mountains. They were gone but a single day, but every moment was a revelation to the little fellow. They were looking for wild turkeys and had bagged several when they came to an opening surrounded by maples, beeches, and other deciduous trees. The grass was fresh, and a dozen sorts of flowers were under their feet as they tied their single horse, on which Davy rode with the game. The men were talking of the West, and as they pointed out across the peaceful land of the Chickasaws, the boy heard often the names of the great rivers, the Tennessee, the Holston, the Cumberland, the Ohio, and the Mississippi. The spirit of unrest that was in their hearts was already in his own, and from that day the Nolichucky was no longer satisfying to him. He wanted something bigger. In the faint echoes of ringing steel and bloody threats that came from the cities of the Old World, those August days, there was somewhat that excited the natural restlessness of the pioneer. The events in France were terrible and momentous. On the 20th of the month before, the black-browed Marcellus, the Reds of the Midi, had finished their long march from the shores of the Mediterranean, and had entered Paris, 600 strong, armed with forks and scythes and pikes, and singing the song of Rouget de Lis, that forever afterwards was to be the war hymn of unrest. The few who had left for the New World had not been missed in the ranks of the starving people of Europe's overcrowded streets and lands. The black chaos of insurrection had burst upon the last defenses of the French king, and it may have been while the three looked westward to the promised land that the Swiss guards, hunted like wild beasts, died to the last man in the Place de Grève. The time for bloodletting had come to France, and the whole world was in a ferment that was soon to set the red men of America in battle against the aggressions of the colonists. There could never have been peace in the Old World until the opening of the New, and that also meant war to the knife. From then until he went forth into the strange places of the East, Davy grew in thought and stature and in the knowledge of the common things, but without any education other than that obtained by the use of sharp ears and keen sight. When he was 7 or more, the whole Crockett family moved to a place about 10 miles north of Greenville. From the habit John Crockett had of going from one place to another, it seemed that he depended mostly upon game and pelts for a living. He could not have been much of a farmer in a country where land had to be cleared before crops could be raised. It was while in Greene County that Joseph Hawkins, brother of Davy's mother, shot a man while hunting, having mistaken him for a deer. The man was gathering wild grapes, and as he reached for the clusters above him, Hawkins thought he saw the moving ears of a deer. As all kinds of game were common in such a place, and hunters were scarce, he took a careful aim and shot the grape-gatherer through the chest. The man finally recovered from the effects of the wound, but Davy tells that he saw his father draw a silk handkerchief through the bullet hole and through the man's body. Such accidents were less frequent in those days, when the human target might be one of a party of Indians skulking in the thickets. In such a case the hunter would be tomahawked and scalped before he could reload, or bound fast, and he might be tortured to death later. A Chicago paper obtained a list of 113 men who were killed in the year 1910 through such mistakes and careless handling of guns. In war, The killed are far less in number than the wounded, but in 1910 only 87 were wounded as against 113 killed. This shows that the hunters who do the killing are much more careful in their aim than in finding out what they have for a target. It is a pretty sure thing that the immediate scalping of such blunderers would save 100 lives every year. Davy Crockett's father used to tell him when he began to use a rifle, "Look mighty hard before you shoot. It may be a man, you see, but you can always get a man." From Greene County, John Crockett moved, after a year or so, to the mouth of Cove Creek, some 25 miles below the mouth of the Limestone. End of chapter 1. Read by Elijah Fisher.
The mill on Cove Creek, swept away, lock, stock, and barrel. The Crockett family keeps moving. Andrew Jackson and the corn thief. A boy'll be after trouble before his ears are dry. The empty cupboard. Lasses boilin's, bean stringin's, butter stirrin's. Bobtail pigs and bawling calves. Davy is sent to Virginia on foot with Jacob Seiler. He gets homesick and longs to see his family. Good friends come to his aid and he returns home. It would appear that John Crockett had some funds upon moving to Cove Creek, for he had once began the building of a mill in partnership with a man named Galbraith. They had about finished the mill, undoubtedly a primitive affair, when trouble came. Over all the flanks and summits of the Appalachian Range the snow lay deep in the shelter of the pines. It was the accumulation of the long winter, compact and covered with a glaze of ice. All through the winter the creek on which the mill was built flowed quietly in its course, held in check by the icy rain of the zero weather. But the stream grew deeper and swifter as the days advanced, and when the swamp apple and the wild cherry were like woodland fairies in their robes of tender pink and creamy white, when the rumble of the partridge's wings was heard and the violets were scarfs of blue hung here and there, the south wind swept along the range with lowering clouds. The heavens were opened, and the rain began. In the twinkling of an eye, the stream they had relied upon to run their mill swept every vestige of their labor out of sight. Lock, stock, and barrel, as Crockett described the disaster. Few men cared to build upon the scene of ruined hopes, and John Crockett moved on again. We follow him next to a place on the road that was frequented by travelers between Virginia and Nashville. Here he kept an inn for the wayfarer, a poor kind of affair, where only such people as wagoners were likely to halt. They were as rough as the roads over which they came, and in feeding such guests there was small profit. The western settlers were always ready to take arms against any authority that held too tight a rein, and each man was as quick to show fight in his own behalf. In his later years, David Crockett remembered the little tavern between Jonesboro and Knoxville as a place of hard times and plenty of 'em. It was there that Davy first saw Andrew Jackson, who was afterwards his leader in the Creek War of 1813. Already the renown of the state's attorney had become a household subject in Tennessee. Jackson feared no man, and brought to justice the most defiant of the mountaineers. The men of that day had a habit of settling their differences out of court, which caused many to die with their boots on. Much the same system even now prevails in some parts of Kentucky and Tennessee. To those who have deplored the passionate natures and the crimes of the foreign element in our country, it may be said that the most lawless and cruel of our citizens are primitive Americans, the feudists of the dark and bloody ground and the Big Bend state. The reason why Jackson had most of the court cases in those days was because they were criminal suits, and to him, as public prosecutor, came the duty of conducting them. One day there stopped at the Crockett Tavern a man from the head of the Limestone, who had come down the Nolichucky with a load of corn that he had stolen from a neighbor. Of this he openly boasted, and he defied anyone to interfere with him. John Crockett told him he did not care to take stolen corn as payment for feeding him and his horses, and asked him to go. But the unwelcome guest said he would stay as long as he liked. The next day, towards dark, appeared a number of horsemen who had been belated by a storm in the mountains. Among them was Andrew Jackson, and there were also 2 or 3 constables and prisoners on the way to Knoxville. Then in his 27th year, Jackson was an ideal leader of men. More than 6 feet tall, slender but muscular, the glance of his dark blue eyes meant more than verbal threats. To him, John Crockett told the story of the vainglorious thief. Jackson told the man that he was under arrest, whereupon the latter at once became violent and threatening. The room of the tavern in which the wagoners spent the spare hours was large and dingy, built of logs, and had been the scene of more than one desperate quarrel. There were enough bullet holes in the logs to prove it. Jackson whispered to a constable, and under the directions of the latter everyone left the room except Jackson and the thief. 10 minutes afterwards the latter came out of the room without his rifle or knife, and sullenly left the place. The horses and the wagon load of corn were left behind, and were afterwards turned over to the man from whom they had been stolen. Davy, who was a lad of 8 or 9 years at the time, had been terrified by the threats of the corn thief, and always wondered at the quiet way in which Andrew Jackson had disposed of him. The small boy's days are short, but full of zest. Having as yet no conscience, or at least a dormant one, he feels no regrets for his misdeeds, but sleeps the sleep of the just, and wakes with all his faculties for mischief wedded. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there is always danger in the air. Davy had brothers whose experiences gave him a good start, and he profited by their example. Up to the age of 5, when he danced with rage on the banks of the shore where he had been left alone, he tells us that he had never worn any breeches. From this we infer that as he was easy to overhaul in flight, and was without any protection from the usual application of punishment, he had to grow and be clothed before he became a serious source of trouble. An Irishman fresh from the old sod will tell you that a boy'll be after hunting trouble before his ears are dry, and once started, he never quits. In Davy's time, there were no jam closets for him to rob, for the cupboard was always empty, except for the great loaves of bread that were baked from corn and rye, everything being devoured as fast as it was cooked. None of the boy's time was taken up with watching the pantry, and his time was his own. If there happened to be such neighborhood events as corn huskin's, lasses boilin's, log rollin's, bean stringin's, or butter stirrin's, which still prevail in the mountains, there was a respite for his victims. Upon one occasion, when his parents had gone to a corn husking, Davy and one of his brothers, with another boy, rounded up all the hogs that were fattening on beech nuts in the woods, penned them up, cut off their tails, and let them go. It was some weeks when their villainy was detected. They were forced to confess that they were guilty, and that the tails had been roasted in hot ashes and eaten. Such mild pastimes as robbing birds' nests were diversified by practical jokes on the traveling public, and many a beating fell to the lot of the Crockett boys. One of the tricks they played was to take the calves away from their bovine mothers after dark. This meant all-night bawling and human wakefulness until the cows were united with their lost offspring. If Elisha had lived in the Tennessee mountains, the bears would have been busy all the time. When Davy was 12 in 1798, he had become a strong and useful lad, with a fully developed conscience. The wishes of his parents were the only law he had known, and when at last the time came when his father said to him, as Saul to him of old, "David, go, and the Lord be with thee," he went forth as a pilgrim. It is not certain with what words he was sent forth, but he seems to have made no appeal from the bargain that sent him 400 miles over the mountains, on foot, in the keeping of a stranger. Perhaps he had come to know that his father found it hard to feed so many mouths. At any rate, he took up the long march with an old German, Jacob Seiler, who was bound to Virginia with a herd of cattle, where he proposed to remain. How many have read with sympathy and keen appreciation Davy's simple story of his departure, with a heavy heart, perhaps never to return. Seiler treated the boy kindly, and paid him $5 or $6 for his help. When he reached the end of his journey, he tried to persuade Davy to stay with him. At first, Davy thought it his father's wish that he should remain, so for some weeks he tried to be content, but the yearning to see his family again was strong within him. One day, as he was playing in the road, there came along 3 familiar faces, those of a man named Dunn and 2 sons, each with a good team. The sight of them was like a sight of home, for they were bound to Knoxville, and the way led past the lowly Crockett Inn. and Davy was soon telling his plight to sympathetic listeners. As his disappearance in the daytime would soon be known, and might result in his being brought back, they told him that if he could get to the place where they were to put up for the night, 7 miles away, they would take him home. All the tiresome journey there, David had come on foot, and at the prospect of riding all the way back, heaven opened before him. To his delight, he found that the good old Dutchman and his family had gone to a neighbor's. Davy's own story of what followed is this. I gathered my clothes and what little money I had, and put them all together under the head of my bed. I went to bed early that night, but I couldn't sleep, for though I was a wild boy, yet I dearly loved my father and mother, and could not sleep for thinking of them. And then the fear that I should be discovered and called to a halt filled me with anxiety, and between my childish love of home, on the one hand, and the fears of which I have spoken on the other, I felt mighty queer. It was 3 hours before daylight when Davy crawled out of his bed. He got away from the house without waking anyone, and found it snowing hard, 8 inches already having fallen. In the absence of moonlight, it was a difficult matter to reach the main highway, half a mile off, but once in that, he steered his way toward the place appointed, guided by the opening made through the woods. He was 2 hours trudging through the snow up to his knees, and his tracks were covered as fast as they were made. The Seiler family must have wondered at his disappearance. Davy found the Dunns up and feeding their teams, and was kindly received. As he warmed himself by the fire, he forgot his struggle with the storm in his thankfulness for the goodness and help. As soon as the breakfast was over, the wagoners set out, and the boy found himself counting the seemingly endless miles of the homeward journey. When they reached the Roanoke Valley, his desire to get home was too great for him to endure the slow progress of the loaded wagons. He could travel twice as fast afoot, so at the house of John Cool on the Roanoke, he thanked his kind friends for what they had done for him, and started out alone on what must have been a tramp of 300 miles. He was near the first crossing of the river in a few hours, and dreaded it, as he would have to wade or swim to the other side in water that was very cold. Then he heard the clatter of horses' feet behind him, and a cheery hail from a man who was returning from where he had sold some stock. He had an extra horse, saddled and bridled, and as he had had also a soft spot in his heart for boys, in a moment Davy was mounted, as proud as a king. In this way he traveled until within 15 miles of home, when he went his way on foot, full of gratitude toward the stranger for his goodness towards a poor little straggling boy. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3. Davy Takes to the Woods. Davy is welcomed home. A schoolhouse in the mountains. He makes an enemy. Wildcat style of fighting. Davy takes to the woods. John Crockett cuts a stout hickory switch. Davy is off for Virginia again. He goes to Baltimore. The Clippers and the Privateer. Prevented from sailing for London. He leaves his self-appointed guardian and starts for home. He crosses New River through slush ice. The trail in spring. A strange boy at the family table. It's Davy come home. Davy reached his father's inn the same night, and his welcome may be imagined. It was late in the fall, and he lived at home until the red flames of the sumac and the poison oak were again fiery spots and streaks upon the hills. Then John Crockett took it into his head to send the boy to a school near by. A crude log cabin with benches hewn from logs and a floor of earth offered its single room to those who came. A great slab of wood, 3 feet wide and standing on hickory stakes, reached across the room and was used as a table for the scholars. Readin', spellin', and cipherin' were the principal studies. Writing, of course, was taught, but the quill pens and poor ink they had to use were as hard to get as was paper, and the blackboard seldom made a penman of an awkward lad. On the 4th day Davy spent in school, he had an altercation with a boy larger and older than he. When the children were dismissed, Davy hid in the bushes and waited for his enemy. As the boy was passing the ambush, Davy set on him like a wildcat, scratched his face to a flitterjig, and made him cry for quarter in good earnest. Young Crockett was now in a bad fix, for he knew there was a flogging in store for him. The next day, and for several days, he left home in the morning, ostensibly for school, but spent the time in the woods until the children went home. His brothers attended the same school, but he had persuaded them to say nothing of his "playin' hookey." When the schoolmaster wrote to John Crockett, telling him of Davy's absence, the whole story came out. "I was in an awful hobble," Davy wrote of this, "for my father was in a condition to make the fur fly. He called on me to tell why I had not been to school. I told him that I was afraid to go, for I knew I should be cooked up to a cracklin' in no time. My father told me, in a very angry manner, that he would whip me an eternal sight worse if I didn't start at once to school." While Davy was begging not to be sent back, the elder Crockett was cutting a stout hickory switch, and from past experience the boy knew what this meant. At his father's first move towards him, he broke into a run. The chase lasted a mile, when the boy dodged aside into the bushes, and his father then gave up the hunt. Davy had been careful to lead off in a course away from the schoolhouse, having a keen idea of his fate if both the teacher and his father should get him at the same time. Fearing to return, Davy kept on for several miles and put up for the night at the house of a man who was about to start for Virginia with a drove of cattle. The boy at once hired out to go with him, and before starting one of the older Crockett boys joined them. Thus was Davy again a pilgrim, with a journey of nearly 400 miles before him. The trail they followed was probably about the same as the route of the Norfolk and Western Railroad of the present time, through Abington, Wytheville, and Blue Ridge Springs, to Lynchburg, passing south of Hanging Rock, to which place Davy had traveled the previous year. From Lynchburg the drove went on to Charlottesville and Orange Courthouse, up the headwaters of the Rapidan, again through the Blue Ridge Mountains to Front Royal on the Shenandoah River, where the stock was sold. Davy and a brother of the man with whom he had started out, with a single horse for the two, now took the homeward trail. They were together 3 days, traveling with so little rest that the boy finally told the man to go ahead, and that he would come when he got ready. He bought some provisions with $4 that the man had given him for the 400 miles journey, and plodded stolidly along until he met a wagoner who lived in Tennessee, and who intended to return after his trip was finished. He was bound for Winchester, not very far away, and he was a jolly sort of fellow. Davy gladly accepted his offer to take him along. 2 days later they met Davy's brother and the rest of the former party, but Davy refused to go with them. He says that he could not help shedding tears as he watched his brother disappear, but the thought of the schoolmaster and of his angry father with the big hickory switch was too potent. At Gerardstown, Virginia, Davy worked for 25 cents a day for a man named John Gray. Adam Myers, the wagoner, was engaged all winter in hauling loads to and from Baltimore. When spring came, Davy had money to buy decent clothes, and something like $7 besides. He took it into his head that he would go with Myers to Baltimore to see what kind of place it was and how people lived there. This came near being Davy's last trip, for on reaching Ellicott's Mills he had perched himself on top of the barrels of flour that made the load, when the horses ran away at the sight of a road gang with wheelbarrows. The frightened animals turned short about, snapped the pole, and then both axle trees, and nearly buried the boy in the falling barrels. Escaping with nothing more serious than bruises, the two went on with a hired wagon, and soon arrived in Baltimore. At this place Davy Crockett nearly became a sailor. The harbor was full of shipping, gay with flags and the glories of fresh paint, loading and discharging the riches of all nations. There were never such ships as the Baltimore clippers. Their memory lives in the hearts of every true sailor. The Flying Cloud and the Cockatoo, the Southern Cross, the Caribou, the Polar Bear and the Northern Chief, the Yankee Blade and the Maple Leaf. The names of the vessels in the good old clipper times were those that set a boy's heart to thumping, and the sight of a great full-rigged ship sweeping out to sea was enough to make sailors of farmers' sons. It was the spring of 1800, and in the port there was a vessel flying the English flag, and then called the Polly. As much of Davy's time as possible was spent on the wharves, and finally he took courage and went on board a vessel about to clear for London. She was a Yankee ship, for in those days every vessel that flew the Stars and Stripes, from Eastport to Savannah, was a Yankee. Seeing the boy gazing about the decks and aloft, one of her men began talking with him. The Polly being at a wharf near by, it was not long before Davy heard the history of the old privateer, which had sailed from Baltimore in 1778, and before her return in November had fought with and captured 3 British armed merchantmen. The Reindeer, 400 tons and 14 guns, with a cargo worth $150,000. The Ula, of same tonnage and 10 guns, and $100,000 cargo, and the Jane, of the tonnage and armament of the Reindeer, and with a cargo also worth $150,000. 1/3 of all this treasure was the share of the government. Before the Polly was unlawfully seized in a neutral port and handed over to the English, she had captured nearly 30 prizes, in many cases fighting desperate battles for the mastery. The master of the ship either took a fancy to Davy or thought that he might prove useful, for before the boy's second day in Baltimore had passed, he had arranged to go to London as a cabin boy. But when he returned, for what spare clothes he had on shore, and told Myers of his intent, the latter refused to give him either his money or clothing, and swore that he should not go. He kept watch over him, prevented him going to the ship, and started back with him as soon as ready, giving him no chance to escape. As he had become very harsh with Davy, threatening him with his whip, the boy left him one morning before daylight. Davy had not a cent in his pockets, but he resolved to go ahead and trust to Providence. This trait was the prominent feature of David Crockett's nature. He made up his mind and went ahead. It was hard to turn him, and he went at everything, hammer and tongs. As the historian contemplates the spectacle of this penniless 13-year-old youngster bravely facing towards his home, 400 or 500 miles away, it is but natural to wonder what would have become of him if he had sailed for London. He might have become a famous sailor, a reckless privateer, or merchant with ships in every sea. Up to this time, Davy had had no schooling, except the 4 days at the place to which he had been afraid to return. Many a boy of the present time is graduated from a high school at 14, but Davy Crockett did not know a single letter of the alphabet. As it was, however, the fates had no idea of sending him to sea, and while the great ship was beating her way along the Atlantic coast, he was resolutely facing west. It was more than a year and a half before Davy was destined to see his home again. Working for 2 or 3 employers, after reaching Montgomery Courthouse, he saved up a little money and finally made another start for Tennessee. For 18 months he had worked for a hatter who failed before paying his wages, and it was a poor and half-clothed stripling that was now returning with a better record, but in no better luck than the prodigal son. At the crossing of the New River, only 40 miles on the old trail he was now retracing, he found high water and stormy weather. No one would row him across, and in his impatience he disregarded all warnings, hired a canoe, and put out into the stream. He finally reached the other side, the boat half full of water, and his clothing soaking wet and freezing upon his back. After going up the river for 3 miles, he found a warm shelter and food. As Davy finally went down the old road into the Tennessee valleys, the woods were full of wakening life. The tender green of the beech and maple shimmered on every slope. Beside his path the arbutus showed its pink-white petals, and the azaleas and juneberries, full of bloom, were eagerly sought by droning bees. The spring wind sang in every pine, and the breath of the hemlock and the balsam was like a rare perfume to the homesick boy. In Sullivan County he encountered the brother who had in vain begged him to return home. Perhaps Davy still dreaded the sight of the old schoolhouse, for it was some weeks before he left his brother's cabin and sought his father's. He had traveled all day, and as he drew near to the wayside inn he saw the teamsters caring for their horses and covering the wagons for the night. He noticed that the poles of some of the wagons pointed eastward, while the others showed that the loads were on the westward journey. The latter were the ones that looked good to Davy, who had had enough of wandering in the east. His heart seemed in his throat as he saw his sisters and brothers going in and out, and he feared at any moment to see his father with the seasoned Hickory, or perhaps old Kitchen, the schoolmaster, looming over him like an inexorable fate. He hung about unseen until the jangle of a horseshoe and a poker called all hands to supper. When they were plying knife and fork, he slipped in and took a seat quietly at the long table. A great pewter platter was heaped with chunks of boiled meat, another was filled with corn on the ear, and still another with potatoes with their jackets on. Bowls of gravy and bread, broken into pieces as the loaves went round, completed the bill of fare. White bread was hardly known in the mountains. Corn and rye, or rye and Indian, seeming to answer every demand of the wayfarer. In those times some taverns had menus to suit the purse and fastidiousness of the traveler. For corn bread and common doin's the charge was 15 cents, but for white bread and chicken fixin's the bill was 2 bits, or 25 cents. Davy tackled the platters as they went the rounds, but in spite of his hunger he was conscious that there were sharp eyes awake to the fact that a strange boy was at the table. His eldest sister had ceased eating in the intentness of her gaze. He was so much larger than when he had left home that she was full of doubt. But at last, as her eyes met Davy's squarely, and his face became red with blushing, she sprang from her seat at the table and screaming, "It's Davy! It's Davy, mother! It's Davy come back!" She threw her arms about his neck, clinging to him with tears of joy running down her face. This was his restoration to those who loved him, and whose reception of the wanderer so touched his boyish heart that he humbled himself before them, no longer fearing that they had forgotten him during the long and weary time he had spent away from them. Davy was now a strong and healthy youngster, almost 15 years old, with much worldly wisdom, but unable to read or write. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4. The Indian's Visit. Davy pays his father's debts. The old man's tears. Gets a suit of clothes. Calf love. Barks up the wrong tree. Finds another girl. Sweet plugs and snuff as evidences of affection. He is gaily deceived and wants to die. Pretty Polly Finlay. Davy marries at last. Other events of the times. Moves to Lincoln County in 1809. Another move. Red Eagle and the Creeks. 3 hungry braves. Tecumseh and Big Warrior. The earthquakes of 1811. The next year of Davy's life was one of hard work and no pay. He had been at home but a short time when his father told him that if he would work for 6 months for a man named Abraham Wilson, Wilson would in return give up a note of John Crockett's for $36. As a reward, Davy could thereafter work for himself without waiting to become of age. The boy fulfilled the compact without missing a day, in a place where some of the roughest of the settlers made a practice of meeting to drink and gamble. At last the note was his, and the joy of his father at its surrender was Davy's recompense. It was always a satisfaction to Davy Crockett to know that his father was a man who honestly tried to pay his debts. The son appears to have had the same spirit. When he asked to be given work at the home of an honest old Quaker, John Kennedy, he found that the man held another note of his father for $40. Davy was offered the note for another 6 months' work, and with a keen desire to do his duty and to ease his father's burdens as much as he could, he disregarded his newly acquired right to work for his own account and started in. At the end of the time he received the note, borrowed a horse, and went home for a visit. "Some time after I got there," Davy afterwards said, "I pulled out the note and handed it to my father, who supposed Mr. Kennedy had sent it for collection. The old man looked mighty sorry, and said to me that he had not the money to pay it, and didn't know what he would do. I then told him I had paid it for him, and it was then his own, that it was not presented for collection, but as a present from me. At this he shed a heap of tears, and as soon as he got a little over it, he said he was sorry he could not give me anything, but he was not able, he was too poor." For 2 months after going back to the Quakers, Davy worked to get something decent to wear. The last good clothing he owned had been left with Adam Myers, together with his $7 of hard-earned cash, when he had quit that troublesome person a few days out of Baltimore. This was nearly 3 years ago, so it is easy to imagine the boy's shabby appearance. About the time when Davy was able to spruce up and aspire to polite society of the kind about him, he fell in love with the Quaker's niece, who had come on a visit from North Carolina, who was much older than he. All the symptoms of what the mountaineers called calf love were forthcoming. He couldn't keep out of the girl's sight, yet nearly choked when he tried to talk to her. When he had reached the proper state of desperation, he acted with his usual headlong energy, and told the young lady that he would die without her. He says that the girl listened kindly enough, but told him that she was to marry a son of the Quaker. Davy concluded that his troubles were mostly due to his lack of learning. He was now in his 17th year, with a record of 4 days at school. He soon arranged with the old Quaker's son, who kept a school a mile or so away, to work for him 2 days in the week for board and tuition, and go to school the other 4 days. This plan was followed for 6 months. "In this time," says Davy, in his later account of his boyhood, "I learned to read a little in my primer, to write my own name, and to cipher some of the first 3 rules of figures. And this was all the schooling I ever had in my life." Davy had now grown to be a stout young fellow, and as he had learned to use a rifle with great accuracy, he became a successful hunter. This was to a great extent a warrant for his plans for securing a wife, and he laid siege to the heart of a pretty young girl whom he had known since his early days. His courting was done without the knowledge of the Quaker, with whom he was now living. In the evening, when all were asleep, Davy would let himself out of the upstairs window by means of a sapling and ride 10 miles to the girl's home, always returning before daylight. She at last agreed to marry him, and the day was set. Lovers were not then given to sentimental tokens of affection. A plug of sweet tobacco, or a bladder of snuff for dipping, was quite the thing to show the state of a young man's feelings. Flowers were nothing but yarbs, and the present of a bouquet of mayflowers or laurel blossoms would have caused inquiry as to his sanity. The mountaineer took no more notice than the Indians of the beautiful things in nature. A few days before the expected wedding, Davy set out, as he told his employer, for a hunt, deer being then numerous. Instead of hunting, he went to a shooting match on the way to the girl's home. Making a deal with another rifleman, who must have had a little money, they took chances in the shoot for a beef, and when it was over, Davy had won. After selling the prize, the partners each had $5, and with that in his pocket and his head above the clouds, the boy went to claim his bride. 2 miles from the girl's home her uncle lived, and there he found her sister. As soon as he began to talk with her, he saw that something troubled her, and then the whole pitiful story came out. The girl had played with him, and was to be married the next day to another man. For a time, Davy was speechless. His pride was hurt, and he turned homeward his lonesome and miserable steps, like a wounded animal stricken with mortal pain. He was thought to be sick for several weeks, for he was too proud to tell his trouble. And in his story of suffering there is ample evidence of the strength of his attachment to those whom he loved. For some time Davy was too low-spirited to care for anything, even hunting. But one day he took his rifle and set out for the woods. On his way home he stopped at the cabin of a Dutch widow, whose daughter, he says, was as ugly as a stone fence. It was this girl, however, who pointed out to him how great a mistake he made in mourning over the loss of a single fish, when the sea was full of others as good. She told him of a pretty Irish lass who was to be at a reaping bee in a few days, and induced him to come too. By the end of the evening the charms of Polly Finlay took possession of his thoughts, and Davy found life more worth living. As in so many cases, the course of true love did not run smooth, for the girl's mother had selected another suitor for her daughter, and she bitterly opposed Davy's suit. After some weeks of courting, Davy won the girl's heart, but when he went to ask for his bride, the old lady ordered him out of the house. With the girl's consent and the tacit permission of her father, the young man secured the services of a justice to marry him on the following Thursday, and made arrangements to have his wife received at the tavern kept by his own father. In Ellis's story of Crockett's life, he quotes the following from the records of Weakley County, Tennessee. Davy Crockett, with Thomas Doggett, security, binds himself in a bond of $1,250 to Governor John Sevier, August 1st, 1806, to marry Polly Finlay. No record of this kind really exists, as Weakley County was not organized until 1823. We do not know what the wedding fee was in those days, but it was probably in the shape of worldly goods of small value. As all sorts of pelts were used for currency, we may imagine Davy paying the justice in coonskins or muskrat hides. To obtain a horse, Davy had agreed to work 6 months, board and lodging free. By giving up his rifle, he came into possession of the animal before the time was up, and when he went to the Finlay cabin, he was able to tell the young woman that he would come for her on the day set, with a horse, saddle, and bridle. When the day came, a Thursday, Davy went to the Finlays, accompanied by 2 brothers and a sister, a brother's wife, and some others, and found a number of neighbors there waiting for the wedding. Mrs. Finlay was up in arms, but Davy rode up to the door and asked the girl if she was ready to light on a horse he was leading. He was displaying his usual determination, which ended in winning the day. After the bride had taken her seat on the led horse, and the party was about to leave, a parley was brought about by the girl's father. The old lady melted at the thought of her girl being married away from home, and the wedding took place without further opposition. What ceremonies the outsiders observed, Davy never related. He says that they were treated as well as could be expected. They were not subjects for a charivari, but it is likely that the free use of gunpowder, liquor, and vocalized mountain air must have made the night one to be forever remembered by the 2 young people who were made man and wife. The next day, Davy and his bride went to the Crockett Tavern for a visit. The young wife's going-away dress was a dark blue homespun, and at her throat was a scarlet kerchief that had been brought from Baltimore by her mother. She is said to have been a very pretty girl, with warm gray eyes and a tender smile. The girl's parents gave them their blessing, together with 2 cows and 2 calves, and when the kind old Quaker, John Kennedy, had arranged for a credit of $15 at the store, they were able to get what they most needed for the cabin they had rented in the vicinity of John Crockett's inn. Polly was skilled in the use of the loom, and for some years they managed to make a living on the rented land. The homestead system was not then in practice, and the settler was called a squatter, and seldom had any other tenure than the pleasure of the landowner. About the time Davy and his wife were making their new home pleasant, Lewis and Clark were returning to Washington from their expedition to the Pacific coast. Napoleon was forming his Confederacy of the Rhine and becoming the terror of all Europe. And the alleged conspiracy of Aaron Burr was discovered and frustrated, though Burr still had the support of Henry Clay, who claimed him to be innocent. 2 months after Davy's wedding, Napoleon made his triumphant entry into Berlin, and was at the summit of his career. The insolence of English naval officers in disregarding the rights of American seamen found fruit in the War of 1812. Yet the most dramatic events of modern times scarcely drew the attention of the people of the western slope of the mountains. Only when some painted prophet from the tribes of the north, or those with whom the French or the Spanish intrigued, went through the borderlands, leaving a trail of unrest and superstitious passion behind him, did the pioneers think of war. The Creeks and the Chickasaws had been peaceful for many years, but among the former tribe and its confederates, a faction of the dissatisfied was slowly gaining ground. So little fear of the Indians prevailed that Davy Crockett did not hesitate to move from Jefferson County to the region about 50 miles west of Lookout Mountain, near the Elk River, where there were all kinds of game, though bears were not as numerous as in the northwestern part of Tennessee. When Davy moved to this new home in Lincoln County in 1809, he had 2 boys, both under 2 years of age. His wife's father, with his own horse, helped the family in moving. Davy again moved in 1810, this time to Franklin County, settling 10 miles below Winchester. Deer were abundant, wild turkeys were found in every forest, and it was an easy matter to supply food for the family. At times, some of the Creeks strayed up from the Coosa country across the Alabama line, and were always treated with courtesy. But after Davy's last shift, the Alabama Indians were not always friendly. The United States government had secured a right-of-way for a highway across Alabama into the Tombigbee region, into which the settlers had begun to go in great numbers. The sight of such an influx of whites had alarmed the Creeks, and Red Eagle, or Weatherford, was the leader of those who now planned to go to war, if necessary, for the preservation of their ancient hunting grounds. Red Eagle was hardly 1/4 Indian, his father having been a Scotch trader, his mother the Creek princess Sehoy, the daughter of a Scotchman named McGillivray. Red Eagle was also known as Weatherford, after his father, Charles Weatherford. Soon after Davy Crockett settled in Franklin County, there came to his cabin 3 Creeks, whose manner was not to his liking. They were evidently spying upon the land, and one of them, who wore a head decoration made of 20 or 30 silver florins, asked for food. "Injun hungry, Injun heap hungry. Walk long time, no eat. White man make 'em supper." Davy went into his cabin, conferred with his wife, and soon reappeared with a large piece of corned beef, which he intended to boil in the kettle that hung from a tripod of stakes in front of the door. The braves took a look at the meat, held a short consultation, and their leader spoke again. "Salt meat no good. White man eat 'em. Injun no eat 'em." Then he pointed to a fine fat calf that was the pride of the family, and said, No eat 'em corned beef. Injun kill 'em calf. Eat 'em calf." Davy shook his head in refusal of the plan proposed and reached for his rifle, which was always at hand. The Indian spokesman thereupon made another suggestion. "Kill 'em calf. White man half, Injun half. Right hand across his body, Injun half." While the Indians were making this effort at compromise, with nothing to lose in any event, Polly Crockett untied the calf, led it into the cabin, and shut the door. The three braves went scowling away. During the year 1811, the great chief Tecumseh, acting as an agent of the British, traveled from the lake region to Florida, where he succeeded in persuading the warlike Seminoles to promise help in fighting the whites. On his way south he visited the Chickasaws in western Tennessee, and although these Indians did not listen with favor to his plans, his visit created an uneasy feeling among the few settlers in their country. In October, Tecumseh, with 30 naked braves, marched into the Tucabacha town while Colonel Hawkins was holding a grand council for the purpose of placating the war party among the Creeks. As long as Colonel Hawkins remained, Tecumseh was silent, but after his departure, the renowned chieftain soon won the majority of the Creek nation to his side. It was in October 1811 that Tecumseh resumed his journey to the north, with the assurance of Red Eagle's readiness to make war when the time should be ripe. In November, the next month, the Battle of Tippecanoe was fought, and General Harrison defeated the Indians, who were commanded by Elskwatawa, the prophet brother of Tecumseh. Before leaving the Creek country, Tecumseh quarreled with the chief Big Warrior, who refused to join in his schemes. Tecumseh told him, so the tradition runs, that when he reached Detroit he would stamp upon the ground and all the houses in Tucabacha would fall to the ground. Some writers mentioning this threat seem to be in doubt regarding the promised earthquake, but on the midnight of December 15th, 1811, after the arrival of Tecumseh in the north, earthquakes along the Mississippi Valley suddenly began. The town of New Madrid disappeared, the face of the country was much changed, and what is known as Reelfoot Lake, 50 miles long and very wide, was formed close to the main river. Of this lake there is more to tell in a later chapter. End of chapter 4.
Davy is a scout. Farmer and trapper, Tallgrass and his boys, the blowguns of the Chickasaws, Looney Joe. Little warrior starts trouble and punishment follows. Davy dreams of higher things. The Spanish at Pensacola aid the British and the hostile Indians. Hurricane Ned brings news from Alabama. The Red Sticks, the massacre at Fort Mims, and the call to arms. Davy becomes a scout under Jackson. Gets his dander up. The independence of the Mountaineer Volunteers. The year of 1811 was a busy one for Davy, who was then coming 25. He was still boyish and rather awkward in some ways, but with the rifle, and in securing pelts of the most valuable sorts, he had few rivals. Shotguns, or scatterguns, were not much used in hunting. Powder and lead were the most precious of all the pioneers' possessions, and nothing smaller than a wild turkey was considered worth the cost of a shot. For that reason, small game was always abundant and almost fearless in the presence of the hunter. One autumn morning Davy was talking with Tallgrass, a Chickasaw, who had 2 of his boys with him. They were from 10 to 12 years old, and each carried a reed blowgun, nearly 10 feet long. Davy had heard of these weapons of the Chickasaws, and he asked the boys to show him how they were used. They all started for the woods a mile away, where small game was plenty. In a swampy spot, the logs lay here and there across the ground, as the result of a cyclone or windstorm in the years gone by. In the northern states, such a place would be called a windfall. In Tennessee, it was called a hurricane. The boys went ahead, their reeds at tilt, like spearmen of feudal days. Each carried small darts tipped with steel, with thistledown tied at the opposite ends. A rabbit flashed from under a bush as they advanced and stopped 50 feet away. The older boy slipped a dart into his reed, brought it to a steady aim, filled his lungs and cheeks, and put all his young strength into the puff that sent the 12-inch arrow on its course. The rabbit leaped from its mound of moss and fell struggling with the dart in its side. A partridge that perched in the limbs of a hickory came tumbling down when the younger boy tried his skill. With dignified pride, Tallgrass said to Davy, "Some day, big chiefs." The boys soon secured all the game they could carry, Tallgrass not offering his aid, and the party started to return. Suddenly a terrifying yell rang through the woods, startling the Indians until they saw a grin on Davy's face. The noise of feet was heard, and there soon appeared what it was intended to represent a warrior in full attire, with paint, turkey feathers, bow and arrows, scalping knife, and moccasins. As the strange creature came closer, the Indians saw that it was a white boy, evidently half-witted. He had trailed them all the way, and had sounded his war cry in what seemed to him the fittest spot for dark and bloody deeds. Tallgrass gave him a disgusted glance and turned away. "Heap full," was all he said. The boy was allowed to go back with them, and was shown the use of the blowgun. He afterwards made one, and became of some use in hunting small game, but he never could get rid of the notion that he was an Indian warrior. He was known as Looney Joe. Some weeks later, the Creek chief, Little Warrior, who had gone north with Tecumseh, returned to Alabama with his 30 braves of the war faction of their nation. In the Chickasaw country, not far north of where Davy lived, they murdered several families of settlers in cold blood. The leaders of the Creek Nation, which was at peace with the whites, answered the demands of the United States government by hunting down and killing the whole party. Justice was satisfied, but the war faction of the Creeks grew fiercer and angrier with each rising sun. The Alabamas, an associated tribe, became especially truculent and killed one of the mail carriers employed by the government. When Big Warrior sent a Creek messenger to the same tribe, inviting their chiefs to a council, they murdered his envoy, and a desultory war began. The danger of an Indian uprising became imminent during 1812, and after the United States had formally declared war against Great Britain on June 18th, every pioneer looked to his rifle and supply of ammunition. While Tecumseh's messengers were distributing the calendars of red sticks to the Creek chieftains, the British warship Guerriere was taking New England sailors from the decks of American vessels in sight of New York City. England was landing supplies and agents in Pensacola for use against the restless Indians, the Spanish acting as go-betweens. Uncle Sam was surrounded by the growling dogs of war without a friend in the world. While thus the clash of arms drew near, Davy still hunted and farmed and trapped on Beans Creek, adding to his fame as a rifleman. And, as he said when he had become known in Congress, laying the foundation of all his future greatness. We should not blame him for his overestimate of his own importance, when the flattering attentions of great men who were equally great politicians had been thrust upon him. If he at one time seriously thought that he might become president, only his lack of education made his imaginings unjustifiable in a nation that has so often chosen its leaders from the humble cabins of the poor. Every day the two parties among the Alabama Indians became more truculent, and frequent encounters ended in bloodshed. In the spring of 1813, the prophet Francis, made to order and ordained by Tecumseh, Peter McQueen, and High Head Jim, began a predatory warfare upon the peaceful Indians and half-breeds, who had good houses and farms. With more than 300 followers, the hostile leaders set out for Pensacola with their plunder, under Colonel Coller, assisted by so many lieutenant colonels, majors, and captains, that his force was like Artemus Ward's regiment of brigadier generals. A force of 200 American volunteers overtook the Indians at Burnt Corn, sent them flying, and proceeded to divide the plunder left by the enemy. Before they had finished this, the Indians attacked them in turn, having rallied when no longer pursued, and the volunteers were driven back and dispersed. As they are not known to have lost more than 2 of their number, they do not seem to have been very desperate fighters. When Hurricane Ned, an old hunter of Hurricane Fork, brought the news of this to Franklin County, he predicted an attack by the Creek war party, who were being urged by British agents to paint themselves for battle. Red Eagle would have temporized with his chieftains, but they seized his children and his Negro slaves as hostages while he was away from home. So he prepared, perforce, to strike a decisive blow at the progress of civilization. The red sticks were thrown away day by day until but few were left. When the last was gone, and the tom-toms were beating, the frenzied braves smeared themselves with vermilion till their naked bodies were like flames of fire. The white settlers and the friendly Indians flocked to the various forts, hastily built of logs. In Fort Mims, 300 or 400 men, women, and children, with about 200 volunteers sent as a garrison by General Claiborne, came together in the middle of August. About the 27th of the month, a badly scared Negro returned to Fort Mims from a hunt for stray cows. He had seen the woods full of Indians, apparently covered with blood, their red skins being ominous of trouble. Major Beasley, who was in command, sent out scouts to the place where the Negro had been. The scouts failed to find Red Eagle and 1,000 braves with him, and the Negro had a close escape from being flogged for lying. 2 days later, 2 other Negroes claimed to have seen the Indians and were whipped. One of them was still triced up when the bell called the people of the fort to dinner. As they went their way, Red Eagle and his savages crept from their hiding places and were within 100 feet of the gates before they were discovered. Then it was found that the gates were blocked by drifted sand and could not be closed. For some hours the battle raged, and before sunset, all but 20 or 30 of the people in the fort had been killed and scalped. A few had escaped through the stockade, and some had been spared as slaves. After in vain trying to stop the fury he had fanned to action, Red Eagle rode away from the scene of butchery, and when he returned on his fine black horse, more than 500 lay dead and mutilated within the fort. No halfway position was now possible, and until the end of the war he was active and aggressive. The whole western slope of the mountains now awoke to the danger. Calls from men were answered by North and South Carolina, and Georgia, and Tennessee, whose volunteers for the defense of New Orleans had recently been recalled from Natchez, also took up the gauge of battle. All her people agreed that Andrew Jackson should be the one to lead the volunteers into Alabama, but he was in bed, suffering from a wound in his left shoulder, caused by 2 slugs from the pistol of Thomas H. Benton in a free-for-all fight. The 2 men were afterwards reconciled and became friends, but Jackson could never wear one of his heavy epaulets for any length of time. While Jackson is generally spoken of as a great Indian fighter, he was not at this time entitled to such a reputation. A few years before, he had been chosen Major General of Volunteers, but most of his actual fighting had been with his personal and political foes. He had killed Charles Dickinson in a duel for slurs upon Mrs. Jackson, and had ridden full tilt at Governor Sevier with the intention of running over him. Before Jackson could take the saddle, a rally was held at Winchester, 10 miles from Davy Crockett's. As Davy there enlisted as a volunteer, it will be worthwhile to hear what he had to say upon the subject. I, for one, had often thought about war, and had often heard it described, and I did verily believe that I couldn't fight in that way at all. But my after experience convinced me that it was all a notion, for when I heard of the mischief that was done at the fort, I instantly felt like going, and I had none of my dread of dying that I had expected to feel. In a few days, a general meeting of the militia was called, for the purpose of raising volunteers. And when the day arrived for the meeting, my wife, who had heard me say I meant to go to the war, began to beg me not to turn out. She said she was a stranger in the parts where we lived, had no connections living near her, and that she and our little children would be left in a lonesome and unhappy situation if I went away. It was mighty hard to go against arguments like these, but my countrymen had been murdered, and I knew that the next thing the Indians would be scalping the woman and children all about there, if we didn't put a stop to it. I reasoned the case with her as well as I could, and told her that if every man would wait until his wife was willing for him to go to war, we would all be killed in our own houses, that I was as able to go as any man in the world, and that it was a duty I believed I owed to my country. Seeing that I was bent on it, all she did was to cry a little and turn about to her work. The truth is, my dander was up, and nothing but war could bring it right again. When the militia was paraded at Winchester, volunteers were called for, and Davy was one of the first to step forward. In a short time, a company was raised, officers were chosen, and they arranged to make a start on the Monday following. The company were all mounted, and when the day came, Davy said farewell to his wife and his little boys, and rode away to the rendezvous. From there, the command went to Huntsville, Alabama, 40 miles south, then to Beatty Spring, where they were joined by other mounted men, until they mustered 1,300. Davy's company was one that stuck together under the same leader, Captain Jones, until they returned to Tennessee. Jones was later sent to Congress. Davy's experience as a scout now began. Major Gibson, who was about to go into the Coosa country to get information about the Indians, asked Captain Jones to let him have 2 men who could be relied upon as woodsmen and riflemen. The captain called Davy, who was now 27, and strong and healthy, with a full beard. Davy expressed his willingness to join the scouting expedition if he might choose his own mate. This being granted, he picked out a friend named George Russell. When Gibson saw Russell, he said he hadn't beard enough to suit him. He wanted men, not boys. At this, Davy's dander was up, and he told the major that by this rule, a goat would have the call over a man, that he knew what sort of a man Russell was, and that he was not likely to be left behind on a march. Seeing Davy's warmth, the major relented and took them both. The temper of the Western volunteers recalls Maclay's story of the backwoodsman who took part. On board of the Hyder Alley, in Cape May Roads, in the fight with the General Monk. He stood near Lieutenant Barney in the action, picking off the enemy with the same deliberation with which he reloaded under a sharp fire. His Buck County blood was up, but his curiosity was not asleep. Twice he had turned to Barney to ask the same question. "Say, Cap, who made this gun I'm using?" Resenting such a breach of naval decorum in a Marine, Barney answered him roughly, ignoring the question. But as it was again asked, he sharply inquired his reason for wanting to know. "Wall," replied the man, with the drawl peculiar to mountaineers, "this 'ere bit of iron is just the best smooth-bore I ever fired in my life." With the Mountaineers' independence, Andrew Jackson had strenuous dealings before the end of the Creek War. End of chapter 5.